Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jerald Mosley. He is a former California Supervising Deputy Attorney General, and he has been researching, writing, and speaking on the topics of law and sex work. And today we are focusing on his book, Sex Workers and Their Clients in Their Own Words. So, Dr. Mosley, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let me first ask you, before we get into the actual content of your book, what made you interested in studying such a controversial and even stigmatized topic as the experiences of sex clients and of sex workers, and their clients? Why do you think it's important to talk about this subject, including their own perspectives?
Well, I came to this work from a purely legal perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I was a lawyer all my professional life, but I never worked in this area. But as a legal intellectual matter, it was always of interest to me how laws about sex work can be justified against American laws and constitutional provisions about privacy and due process. And so I think it's worth mentioning that I am an example of the fact that you don't have to be self-interested as a sex worker yourself in order to find this interesting and then very concerning. That can happen to anyone who looks at the matter, studies the matter, and who's interested in constitutional principles and law. And that's what happened to me. I sort of got into it slowly and began to read about it, and my concerns grew and grew. And when I retired from the Attorney General's office, I then dedicated myself to researching this issue and interviewing sex workers and clients, trying to sort of break through the stereotypes and to find out what was really there. The people that I talked to are people who needed to be talked to because people don't talk to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we will get in a second into the ideas that the population, that people in general have about sex workers. But let me just ask you, in the context of your book, what counts as a sex worker? And do you focus on specific kinds of sex workers, or are you giving voice to sex workers in general?
Well, setting aside my book for 1 second.
Okay.
The phrase sex work is a very loosely defined phrase, and it can cover any kind of sexual service, whether it is OnlyFans work, phone sex, pornography, stripping, and then what we call prostitution, which is illegal in my country. And that's the reason why, in my own mind, there's this sharp distinction between illegal physical sexual contact for money and all kinds of other sex work. But I wanted to start off by saying the phrase sex work itself is very expansive. It's very expansive. Now, that actually poses a bit of a problem for someone like me who's a lawyer, because what I'm interested in, it's what's legal and what's illegal. that's not the same distinction as between sex work and non-sex work. So in my book, and I put it in a footnote somewhere, and whenever I write, I have to make this clear. I will use sex work here to mean the kinds of sexual services that are illegal in the United States. And that is physical sexual contact for money. So that's how I use the phrase. And when you and I are talking, I will probably use the phrase without thinking to refer to illegal sexual services. But I just wanted to make clear that in general out there, the phrase is much more expansive than that.
Mm-hmm. And how does the general population tend to think about sex workers? What are some of the most common ideas people have about them?
Well, it is evolving. It is evolving. Now, there is what you might call the old-fashioned view, but it's still, there's still a lot of it out there. So it's not gone. And it's the stereotype of the sex worker that is the prostitute, as being just a reprehensible individual on all kinds of different levels, and they are unclean and unsafe and just basically disreputable human beings. You take the word icky and then you give it all kinds of respectable verbiage, but that's what it ends up being, is just they're so icky. And so a great deal of stigma is always surrounding sex work. Now, I say it's evolving because nowadays in the United States, and I think I can safely say in most of Europe, at least most of Western Europe, there is an evolving attitude of seeing the sex worker as a victim rather than as just a lowlife that you want to get away from. And seeing seeing the sex worker as a victim entails a lot of social, political, and legal implications. There is a great deal of, well, I'll just say attitudes rather than carefully articulated beliefs, attitudes that essentially sex work is this very, very bad thing out there whereby men hurt women. And that is, of course, very, very simplified, and people will have all kinds of different ways of approaching that. But there is that rudimentary sentiment out there that is sex workers are themselves harmed and clients do the harming.
Right.
And it's very simplistic, and it is, in my opinion, just as wrong-headed as the old-fashioned view. But we live at a time where both of those stereotypes are mingling together in the public.
So let me ask you now, and this now is about you, directly about your book. You contrast the voices of sex workers and their clients with the claims made by prohibitionists. And prohibitionists here, I guess, can include both, as you mentioned, the old school kind of way of thinking, I mean, the more conservative prohibitionists, but also the more the feminists, the prohibitionist feminists, the more progressive ones that also have arguments against sex work. So, but how would you frame the debate here? What are people debating exactly?
They're not debating one thing.
Okay.
Uh, uh, on the one hand, you have very practical debates about harms. And many of us try to focus the debate on practical harms, but that is one debate out there. You know, is sex work conducive to violence? Is sex work conducive to health problems? Does health work, is it conducive to labor abuse? Those very practical and empirical issues. There is also the debate, and these are not separated cleanly. You know, if you debate this, you have to expect to find both of them going on at the same time. There are abstract philosophical or religious beliefs and feelings that are essentially independent of those empirical issues about harms. But and I will just call them philosophical, they're actually sometimes very, very explicitly religious, sometimes they're more generally moral. But I will just call them philosophical or the abstract approaches. And those approaches just see sex work as demeaning or degrading without attaching an empirical meaning to those words. They are just, and it's a very intense feelings, but based on an abstract approach to sex work. It is evil, and it diminishes the person. And so you have those two strains. And if you're arguing like I do and many people do for decriminalization, you always have to be prepared to deal with both of them because they're both out there.
And so let me just ask you about what I mentioned earlier, that you in your book decided to put side by side the arguments put forth by prohibitionists and quotations from sex workers and their clients about their own lives and experiences. I mean, why did you think that it was important to structure the book in that way?
Well, the one simple reason is because for many people who are conventionally raised like I was, conservative, conventionally, it's just downright surprising. You just don't expect so many sex workers to say these sorts of things, and people need to know it. Now, that's the simple, straightforward answer to your question. As a matter of fact, my first thought about doing this book was to just have two columns and the quotations and not do anything else. Not tell the reader anything, not even to introduce it. Just say, look at this. You know, look at this and be surprised. And you take it for what it is, and, you know, you do with it what you want. But of course, in the process of figuring out how to actually structure the book and get it published, you know, I added on the other material. But one reason, aside from the simple reason, one reason is I want to structure it that way is it is very difficult to know how to counter what I would call one of the abstract arguments. If someone says that is degrading and demeaning, or that, you know, diminishes your personhood, one of my favorite phrases, how do you rebut that? I mean, one thing you can do is to try to play the philosophical game, and in this context, I think it is a game, and just talk about, well, what is personhood, and what is diminishing, and what is there, and I don't know how far that gets you. And so I tried to do something else. I tried to juxtapose the abstract but really rather vicious opposition to sex work with sex workers who don't respond philosophically. They just talk about the concrete aspects of their life. And that's all they're doing. And to juxtapose this very, very concrete, practical description of their lives against very, very abstract condemnations of what they do. And then inviting the reader to say, now, to what extent are these abstract arguments relevant to the practical reality of this sex worker? And once you begin to try to connect the two, then you begin to ask yourself, what do these abstract phrases actually mean? Do they really mean anything? Or are they just out there as linguistic tools to trigger an emotional response? Is that the only function that they have? And so I'm trying to get at that when I juxtapose them with practical, down-to-earth descriptions of how sex workers work. For example, there's a lot of the prohibitionists talk about how cool and dominating clients are, and they like to use the word power imbalance and dominating and then cruel, and then you juxtapose that with, and I was surprised to hear this too. They're amusing, but then they're very, very touching and important. And one sex worker says, I got clients who try to give me an orgasm, and of course I can't come all the time, but they try so hard, they deserve a pat on the back. I mean, and another sex worker says, I got to spend so much time just convincing my clients that they're not bad people. It's okay. It's okay. Well, and those kinds of statements are surprises to people who were raised in the world that I was. People who are raised in that world need to hear those voices, and they especially need to hear those voices when they are asked to listen to these philosophical debates.
So just to make this point clear, what were the main goals that you had in your mind? What goals did you have in mind when writing this book? Because there's, I guess, at least one point that we have to address here. There is the fact that you interviewed sex workers and some clients. You put their experiences, their statements in the book, but it's a limited number of sex workers and a limited number of clients. So someone could put forth the criticism that we can't generalize from that number and make broader claims about sex workers in general, for example. But were you simply trying to show people that there are some sex workers and some clients out there that do not experience sex work the ways that prohibitionists tend to claim?
Yeah. For example, you you take the sex worker who says, she has to spend a lot of time making her clients feel good, and you know, they're almost pathetic in the way they try to please her. No one suggests that all sex work is like that, and I certainly don't suggest that.
Mm-hmm.
What I want to do is refute universalizing philosophical pictures of sex work. And that's different than taking sex workers and generalizing and say, gee, see, I've now discovered what sex work is like. It's always like this. I don't try to do that. Mm-hmm. And of course, you know, but it is, I believe, effective in confronting universalizing statements about what is inherent in sex work. If you believe that dangerous, power-hungry, dominating clients are inherent in sex work, then I want to show you all the people that you have to disbelieve in order to get to that conclusion. And there are a lot of them. And they have different things to say. But you cannot take from what they say and take seriously a universalizing or essentialist view of what sex work inherently is.
Right.
You know, people, well, a lot of people who think that sex work should be decriminalized, they don't. They don't want to tell you what sex work is, like it's some philosophical discovery. Now, there are exceptions, but here I'm generalizing. That's not the point. The point is you cannot rationally come up with generalizations that justify the typical stereotypes and that justify the kinds of laws that we have. Mm-hmm. And you can't do that because the number of people you have to disbelieve just keeps growing. And, you know, you can start off by saying that they have some illusion or delusion or mental problem, but, you know, they keep coming and that retort gets weaker and weaker all the time. So all that process of arguing can be done without having a systematically rigorous sampling of sex works to generalize into an overall statement about sex work. Because one reason why that's extremely difficult to do is because it's illegal. And you're asking people to come forward who break the law and then have some sort of statistical mechanism to make sure you're getting a representative sample. That would be extremely difficult to do. But there's a lot that can be done short of that.
And do you think that people might also be missing something if they tend to think that most or even all sex workers are female and most or all clients are male? I mean, because there are also male sex workers and female clients. Do you think that if people have in their minds this picture of sex workers always being female and clients always being male, that they would be missing something about this subject?
I mean, I don't think there's any question that that's the stereotype, and that's what's in people's minds when they talk about the law and when they talk about their philosophical perspective. They imagine a woman selling and a man buying, and it is, as you say, it's not true that that's always the case. But it is important to understand that that's not always the case, because many of the say essentialist arguments and philosophical arguments assume that it's a woman who is selling and a buyer who is buying, and that women are now being subjected to a patriarchal dominance, and that sex work is just another example of or inscription of patriarchal dominance. All that kind of talk assumes that you're talking about a woman who is providing sex and a man who is buying it. And one of the things that I tried, well, I didn't try for long. I had one conversation with a group of folks, and there were a lot of LGBTQ representatives there.
Mm-hmm.
And I brought up the suggestion, which I still believe in, but I couldn't get that ball rolling. So, why doesn't the gay community bring a lawsuit? And in most jurisdictions in the United States, you can bring an as-applied lawsuit. You can say, here is this constitutional principle, or here is this legal principle, and we're not going to argue that the law is always wrong. We're going to argue that as applied to us, it's unconstitutional. And I say, look, you guys, there are a lot of straight and gay men who sell sex. Why don't you bring a lawsuit as applied and say the law against prostitution is unconstitutional as applied to me, and then force the other side to come up with all the arguments about why sex work is supposed to harm you? I would be delighted to see a lawsuit like that. But there are, there's always economic reasons, and then maybe political reasons when that hasn't been done. It's hard to do because you have to get a representative client, and this is illegal behavior and it's stigmatized behavior. But I mention that just because I want to emphasize the fact that so much of the argument that goes on rests on the view that sex work is all about men hurting women.
Right.
That's
so So let's now go through the main claims made by prohibitionists and what some of the sex workers, the ones you interviewed, have to reply to them or to say about them in their own words. So first, the prohibitionists tend to make claims about their subjective lives, and they use terms like self-contempt, loss of dignity, degradation, dehumanization. What is the main claim made here by the prohibitionists? And then we can get into what the sex workers themselves say.
Well, you have to be careful about trying to pin down the thing that prohibitionists say.
Okay.
Prohibitionists will say anything that they can get away with saying, and words like degrading and demeaning and disrespectful, they do not have a clear enough defined meaning to restrict prohibitionists. They will throw out those words whenever it's convenient. So I don't want to say, gee, this is their one thing that they have to say. What they want to emphasize is that it's very bad for the provider, and they're usually talking about a woman provider, because it diminishes that person. And then you can go into all of the synonyms that you want to use, degrading and exploiting and all those kind of, we could talk about words for a long time. Even the word exploitation In many contexts, that has a clear enough meaning, but not when you're talking about sex work. The whole meaning of exploitation collapses when you're talking with prohibitionists. They will simply want to say that sex work is exploitive by its own nature, inherently. And you say, well, so what do you mean by that? I mean, you certainly don't mean that the guy needs to pay more. That's not what you mean. And isn't it ironic that if he doesn't pay her anything, that's not exploitation? But as soon as he actually pays her, then it's exploitation. So you just see the word in the context of sex work just collapses. My favorite example is there's an underage girl, I guess in high school, and she was taking, the sex pictures of herself, nudes of herself, and sending them out some on social media or something. And she was arrested. Now, I don't know that she was ever convicted. I'm not sure what actually happened, but she was charged with exploitation, sexual exploitation, because she was exploiting herself. Now, that's how bizarre the notion of exploitation gets. But I digressed a little bit in talking about exploitation. Let's call them the abstract prohibitionists. What they want to do is simply to instill and to reinforce the stereotype that there's something very, very icky about prostitution, and they don't want to use the word icky, so they sound philosophical by using all of these other terms. I like to think of it as it's a way of spitting and sounding philosophical at the same time. So anyway, that's what they're trying to do. They're just trying to say that we should have an emotionally averse feeling to sex workers. Now that's the abstract people. There are other people who make empirical claims, but if we're just talking about the abstract folks, it's very, very difficult to pin them down. And that's the same reason why their arguments ultimately collapse on themselves. That's just what they're trying to do.
Right. And we will also probably get into some of the empirical claims made by them later in our conversation. But when it comes to the topic of satisfaction and well-being, of subjective life in general, could you give us examples of what some of the sex workers you interviewed have to say on that topic?
Yes. Now, and now that this can become an empirical issue, and one that's legitimately studied, the mental health of sex workers. And there's a stereotype that they all must be miserable because, well, gee whiz, they got to be miserable. And I'm sure that there are sex workers who are miserable. It does happen. No question about that. I mean, there are, I was a lawyer all my career, and I guarantee you that there are legal secretaries out there who are miserable. In sex work, if you have a sex worker who was born in a culture where it is intensively stigmatized, but now for whatever reason, now she is taking money, she may very well feel miserable. That may very well happen. But what is important from a legal perspective is what's the generalization? What characterizes sex work? And the empirical evidence is that mental health issues do not characterize sex work. You do. There's empirical research and they found a good number of sex workers say, I mean, there are many studies, but just to point to a few of them, I mean, there are some studies, especially of indoor sex workers, and they'll say, sex work has enhanced my self-esteem. That notion is utterly incredible to many conventional Western people. They just cannot believe that.
Right.
But that's what you find. Now, not all of course not. And there's much less of that kind of talk if you're talking about women who work on the street. There's a great deal of variation in sex work. Barbara Brentz studied brothels in Nevada, and her conclusion was, look, when you have problems with the emotional life of a sex worker, as a general matter, they stem from two things. One, and we're talking about brothels in Nevada, so we're talking about women. One, she's not getting enough clients. She doesn't make enough money. Two, stigma. Those are the two factors that are behind most emotional or mental difficulties when they do arise. And, she quotes two of them. One sex worker says, this was just terrible and nobody should ever do sex work. And then another one says, this was the best thing that ever happened to me. I love it. And we just have to accept the fact that there are all kinds of sex workers doing all kinds of work for all kinds of reasons. And it is not true that mental health issues characterize them. And when you do have mental health issues, the odds are that you're going to find that it's basically business related, not having enough customers, or the stigma that they have to live in. We've created a world that stigmatizes these people, and then we scratch our heads and say, gee, why do they feel bad? Well, there's a reason.
And when it comes to that point on stigma, isn't it the case that prohibitionists or abolitionists, either from the conservative end of the spectrum or the more progressive end of the spectrum, aren't they all also contributing to the stigmatization of sex workers with the kinds of claims they make?
Of course. I mean, and of course, like I say, it is evolving. Overall, I would agree they're contributing to stigma. Now, there are some who would argue, well, we're just saying they're victims and the clients are evil. Well, you're certainly stigmatizing the clients. And it can be said you're stigmatizing the sex workers too. There was research done in the Netherlands about how sex workers feel about their work.
Right.
And they have complaints. And so you read and you look at they poll them. Well, what are their complaints? And their complaints are exactly the same complaints that employees have. I want to make more money. I want to have more flexible hours. And then another thing they say is the government treats us like victims. That is their complaint. Those are sex workers themselves complaining about that. So that's a good reason to say even the more contemporary victimizing philosophy that just continues stigma in a different form.
And another very interesting thing, or something that I find really curious about the arguments coming from the prohibitionists, is that one very common thing they claim is that prostitutes in general do not have a choice. That is, they're basically implying that no one, if they were not in specific kinds of circumstances that forced them into sex work, would, from their own free will, choose this kind of work. I mean, isn't that also a little bit condescending?
Well, it's really outrageous what prohibitionists have done with the notion of consent. And of course, the notion just strips sex workers of any kind of agency. But you know, like the word exploitation, the word consent has now been virtually destroyed as a useful and honest term to use whenever we're talking about sex work.
Mm-hmm.
The argument, for example, that, well, she didn't consent to sex work because she needed the money. Well, I'm sure that's true. And, you know, that does not mean that she did not consent to this work. But if you continue to use the word consent like that, if you find any pressure, economic or otherwise, then you're going to use non-consent. If you're going to use that word like that, then the only fair way to talk about consent is in a comparative way. And instead of taking a sex worker and saying, does she consent? You should take a sex worker and say, how does she compare to this other person who makes life's decisions based on economic pressures or any other pressures? I have a lady from Guatemala who doesn't speak very good English, and I speak to her in Spanish a bit. And she cleans my house every once in a while, and I pay her to do that. You know, I don't think she really enjoys mopping the floors in my house. She does it because she needs the money. And I try to give her a reasonable pay for that. That does not mean that I'm a slave driver. It doesn't mean that she's a slave. If you take you take lawyers. I was a lawyer. The last, why did I do it? Well, I did it because I wasn't independently wealthy. I couldn't, retire to Tahiti and put my feet up. I had to work for a living. That does not mean that I didn't consent to it. That's not how we use the word consent. In Norway, I hope things have calmed down a bit, but they're really into trafficking. And trafficking, forceful prostitution, is a very big evil. We can get to that later on. That is not consensual prostitution. But they're trying to attack trafficking, and they arrested a guy and charged him with trafficking, and I believe they convicted him of trafficking. And that's because he brought in migrants, and I believe they came in from Eastern European countries, maybe from Romania. And they had the women testify. And the women said, no, we did this voluntarily. We chose to do this. But they still convicted him of trafficking. You know why? Because the court said in Romania, they didn't have economic opportunities. Therefore, they did not come of their own free will. Therefore, you are a trafficker. Now just think of that way of reasoning. It's just appalling. What if he had brought them from Romania and he had hired them to clean toilets in public restrooms? And that was their best economic option. Would he have been arrested? No. They would have thanked him for giving a job. So there's no, now I'm not saying that sex work and cleaning toilets are the same thing. They're very, very different. They have very, very different consequences. But consent is not the difference. Consent is the thing. And people get very, very extreme in these notions. I mean, there's one prohibitionist who said, you know, the money coerces the sex, therefore it's rape. That is just irrational. But she can get away with saying it because it feeds into a stereotype and what people want to believe. And I've gone on a long time, but it is just so upsetting what people can get away with when they're talking about consent, because true trafficking is a very, very bad thing. And it is very, very hurtful. And they want to pretend that consensual prostitution is trafficking. And that's just an awful thing to do. And it's intellectually dishonest.
So when it comes to the point of work, sex work, but also work more generally, and also at a certain point there you mentioned trafficking, isn't it interesting that when it comes to other activities, like, for example, construction work, there are certain places on Earth where people are trafficked into that form of work. And there are also other examples, of course, agriculture and so on. But people in those specific cases only worry about ending that trafficking and not ending the activity itself. But in this specific case of sex work, they take one step forward and argue that if there's any trafficking at all, then the solution is just to prohibit any kind of sex work. Isn't it interesting?
Well, yes, and that's true. And if you focus on all the emotion behind stereotypes of sex work, it's not surprising. It's not reasonable at all, but it's not surprising. Because when you're talking about sex work, people have so much philosophical animosity that they will jump on the solution of let's do away with all sex work, even though it's not reasonable, even though, like you say, they would never say that about construction work or agriculture. They want to do away with sex work first. Second, they want to do away with trafficking, and so they use trafficking as a way to do away with sex work. Now, you can get into, you can have an honest argument with a pragmatic person about, well, is it true that, once you decriminalize it, more sex work happens, and if more sex work happens, then more trafficking happens, and so simply as a statistical matter, don't the prohibitionists have a point that when you're talking about sex work, the only remedy is really do away with it. And I can accept that as an honest concern and one that has to be addressed. The point is it has been addressed. And people have looked at it. People have empirically looked at decriminalized contexts. And no, trafficking does not increase in those jurisdictions. We have jurisdictions. We don't have to just speculate about this. We have New Zealand. We have most of Australia as two of the clearest examples of decriminalization. And in other jurisdictions, you have legalization, which is heavily regulated. And you do not find an increase in trafficking. You have to go through statistics. And once again, you have to be very, very careful that you keep people honest when you're in this debate. Because if you're not careful, what you're going to find is you're confronted with someone who says, why, of course, trafficking increased. And what do they mean? They mean that sex work increased, but they believe that no one can consent to sex work. Therefore, all sex work is trafficking. And in some jurisdictions, if you have an increase in sex work, they will claim that's an increase in trafficking. So you always have to be on guard. But if you're serious about what trafficking means as force or fraud or underage, it's just not true. New Zealand is one of the clearest examples of decriminalization. And they were very serious about finding out what would happen. New Zealanders are ordinary Western people. They weren't out on some radical binge, and they wanted to make sure that this was going to be okay, that there were no bad effects from this radical thing they were doing of decriminalizing. 5 years after, and I believe they did another one 10 years after, they had this government-sponsored review to find out what the effects were. And the end result was they found sex workers are better off. They're not worse off. They're not being trafficked. They're better off. Now, the word trafficking meant back then, it meant something different in New Zealand. You have to be careful about the statistics. And trafficking did not go up, and certainly not in the legalized environment. But if say Americans and Western Europeans have a broader definition of trafficking, even if you use that broader definition, you go to New Zealand, they still say, look, they're better off. It improved their lives. It did not hurt them. You go to Australia, it has a long history of decriminalization. It does not increase trafficking. The state of Victoria in Australia, they had legalized prostitution, means it's regulated, it's not decriminalized. They have all kinds of, they surround it with all kinds of regulations. And they had that system for years. They know about that system. And you know what they finally decided in 2021? Let's just decriminalize it. That will be better. Just the opposite of what you would think if loosening restrictions increase trafficking. So for the honest person who's actually concerned about trafficking as an empirical reality, we have a lot of data for it. We need to keep fighting trafficking. There's no question about that. But the way to do it is to decriminalize. Decriminalizing does not exacerbate trafficking, and it is probably the case that it will help. I mean, what you need to do is to think of the situation where sex workers are no longer afraid of the police. They don't hide from the police. The police are their protectors. And if they face violence, they can call the police. And the sex workers will be the ones who will know about trafficking if it's happening. Sex workers have no desire for there to be trafficking. Why would an adult consensual sex worker be interested in down the street some 17-year-old being forced into sex work? If the police have a good working relationship with sex workers, it will help in the battling against trafficking. I mean, the The problem of trafficking is vastly exaggerated because people conflate it with just ordinary prostitution. And so it is, it's extremely exaggerated. Nevertheless, it's there. And if it happens one time, it's a very bad thing and you need to stop it. No question about that. But decriminalization is not the problem. Decriminalization helps matters. It doesn't hurt matters.
So let me ask you now a little bit about some of the words and concepts that the prohibitionists use in their discourse. So earlier, even you mentioned a word such as exploitation. So when it comes to claims made by prohibitionists in the context of sex work, does exploitation have a concrete meaning?
Well, no, even in ordinary life, in say economics, exploitation is a bit loose.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, if you're talking about workers being exploited, you know well enough what's being meant, and it's a useful term. In sex work, it's not. And it's interesting to speculate as to why people sort of sense that it must mean something. And I can only imagine a very traditional view, you know, of the female as being a sexual commodity. This is an irony here. You know, it's not the pimp who's talking about commodity, but it's the government, it's prohibitionists treating a woman as a sexual commodity. And then if you take that commodity without compensation, then you're exploiting her, but money can never be compensation. Some kind of ideas like this. I'm speculating and I'm trying to put myself in their minds what they must think about. I mean, and there are prohibitionists who talk about, you know, sexuality is inherent to a woman's personhood. So it's a very interesting thing to say because you don't say that about a man. And so I think that there are a lot of women who might think about that and decide not to go in that direction, but some have, and that's the best I can do to try to put myself in the frame of mind of people who say sex work is always exploitation. You know, in the state of Washington, in my country, they had a law against sex work, and they used the term, I believe it was prostitution that they used. Mm-hmm. They amended the law so that it says the same thing, except they say exploited individual. Even in the codified law, they decided to use the word exploitation, exploited person. You know, and you know, my suggestion, tongue-in-cheek suggestion is, you know, some client who is being charged with exploitation should go into court and should defend himself by saying, yes, I paid her for money. I'm a client of a prostitute, but I didn't exploit her. And see what the judge says. Now, that's tongue-in-cheek. He's not going to get very far doing that, but those are the ideas that you have, and the way the word exploitation has been totally wrecked for political purposes.
And still on the topic of exploitation and also powerlessness, I've heard and read some feminist sex workers, and even if they are not sex workers, some feminists who are, let's call them sex positive, so they are not against sex work, claiming the opposite of what the prohibitionists claim. That is, some of them say that know actually sex work, or they look at sex work as a form of empowerment and of them being in control of their own work because they establish their own rules. So that there's also that feminist perspective out there, right?
I'm a straight male.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way I imagine it. I imagine, if there's a woman and I want to have sex with her, she gets to set the terms. I'm not the one with power. She is. Now, so then that makes a lot of sense to me. And there are women who are sex workers who talk about empowerment. No question, there are.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said at the beginning, generalizations are dangerous. I don't want to generalize and say that sex work is always empowering, or it's never empowering. It's a very respected author, Ronald Weitzer, who writes on sex work. He's a sociologist, and he says, he's very good. He's very good on this, and he says that there are paradigms, and there's the victim paradigm, and there's the empowerment paradigm, and people select which paradigm they want. And he says, you shouldn't do either one. You shouldn't sell yourself to either one. He calls it the polymorphous paradigm, which means you have a lot of different people doing a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. Why can't we just accept that fact? And so, what can I say? To me, it sounds empowering, but I'm sure that, for a lot of women do not see it that way. And that's fine. That should not affect the law, and it should not affect my attitude toward them or my stigma. Either way, it's none of my business.
Right. So another kind of word that prohibitionists sometimes use is coercion. So they say that they associate sex work with coercion. They say that the only reason why of course, most of the time they're talking about women, the only reason why women go into sex work is because they are coerced into it. What do they mean by that?
Well, I don't like to. I think I need to constrain my criticism of people I don't agree with. But at a certain point, you have to talk about honesty. To say that sex work is intrinsically coercive so blatantly flies into facts, the empirical facts, that you just can't, you can't take it seriously as an empirical proposition. You have to take it seriously because of its emotional content and the emotional reaction that people will have. Now, if you talk to sex workers, you realize that no, they're not being coerced. If you just think about sex work, you say, no, they're not being coerced. They're deciding to take money. And so it's hard to know what to say to a person who says, well, it's just all coercive. If they're trying to be empirical, if they're trying to say, all those women out there are coerced, well, then there's an empirical answer to that. And it turns out you're just wrong. It's just not true. In any ordinary meaning of the word coerced, it's not true. And we can get back into the issue of consent. Yeah, of course they're doing it because they need money. But it's simply not true. If by coercion you mean something more abstract, you just mean, well, that intrinsically it's the inscription of the patriarchy and they have power, and the woman in the sex change it is stigmatized more than the man. And I think that that's behind what a lot of what people are talking about. That doesn't translate into coercion. That translates into a real problem about stigma, but it doesn't translate into coercion. You know, people like to sound sophisticated and talk about power dynamics. And they'll talk about in the sex work relationship, there's a power differential. One party is more powerful than the other. And what they really mean is the man is more powerful than the woman. Well, first of all, they just like to use the word power because in this case, it's a bit vague. But, you know, I mean, I can go a long way. I mean, it's like, I will imagine, although I don't know if it's true or not, but I will imagine that the man always has a lot more money than the woman does. The man has a way of getting a lot more money. The man can write a letter to the editor of the newspaper and it will be published a lot sooner than the woman does. So he has that social power, economic power. So there's a power differential. And what they want to do is they want to say there's a power differential and then they want to stop talking like they've made a point. What is the point? I don't know what the point is. I think the point is they want to insinuate that power is being used to coerce the woman. But you have to make that case. You don't just say there's a powerful man there. I mean, the powerful man buys a cup of coffee at a coffee shop, and the woman who provides him the coffee doesn't have power like he does. He's got a lot of power. But that doesn't mean he's coercing her. And as a matter of fact, the powerful man, you know, paying the woman, you can imagine him as that being one part of his life where he doesn't have that much power. And, you know, this woman is going to limit him. You can imagine it that way just as much as you can imagine something else. So you can talk about power dynamics and you can talk about a power differential, and you may have a lot to say. There may be, you may look at the evidence and say, gee whiz, in almost all the cases, the man is more powerful than the woman. But you haven't made an argument yet. You know, that does not mean coercion. That does not mean lack of consent. It just means that there are some jobs that are more lucrative than sex work jobs. Mm-hmm. Although the researchers who have researched the money angle have found out that there are a great many people, middle class women, young women, who do sex work because the money is just good. That's a whole other issue too. The issue of coercion, that's just blatantly flies in the face of reality. Reality is concerned by research. What can you say?
So there are also middle-class women that go into sex work. I'm asking you because we have also this very common idea that it's only poor women who choose, or in the words of the prohibitionists, are coerced into sex work. So, but that's also not entirely true, right?
Well, I use the word middle class. I'm thinking about one researcher who determined a lot of middle class and young people are going into sex work. I hate to make any bald pronouncements based just on one piece of research.
Okay.
Sociology, the more the better. But that was what that person found. And other people have found the economics are quite surprising. And there was one study that was done just to figure out why the money is so good. Now, of course, the phrase "so good" is a relative term. But there is a stereotype of women, of sex workers, as workers who work on the street. that stereotype, I think, is wearing a little thin. But the old-fashioned stereotype has them as streetwalkers, the phrase streetwalker. She's walking on the street. She's poor, very poor. She's addicted to drugs. She needs money, and she will do anything to get it.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, that's a horrible picture. And she needs help. No question about it. But the numbers that I've seen are that about 20% of sex work is sex work on the street. That means 80% of sex work is indoors. 80%. Now that could be a brothel, a massage parlor, but it also be escort agencies.
Right.
Where the woman is living in her apartment and she gets a call from, not from a client, but from her madam. And we need to address the phrase madam here, because this madam is more like the sex worker's employee than anything else. And the madam says, I've got a client for you, so and so, such as you. And she says, okay, yeah. Now, I don't know how much she makes, but she makes a lot more than the streetwalker, I'm sure. And there is, I believe, I quote her in the book, Norma Jean Almodovar. And she was one of the first ex-sex workers that I interviewed and I talked to. And, she was high-end escort. And, she's playing around with celebrities and wealthy people. I don't have dollar figures for you, but that was not a poor lifestyle for her.
Right.
And it's just not true that, well, the 20% don't represent everybody. We should pay attention to the 20%. We should make sure that they're protected. And for God's sake, can you give them a job maybe? All kinds of things you can do with the 20%, but they don't represent the 80%. It's not true that this is, destitute women looking for sustenance. That empirically is just not true.
So, and what can we say about violence in sex work? Because one of the common claims made by prohibitionists is that if not all, at least most sex workers are victims of violence, that there's a very high prevalence of violence in sex work. Is that true or not?
Well, once again, we have to appreciate the fact that there's no one thing that's sex work. They're all different kinds of sex workers doing all different kinds of work in all different contexts. Now, and not surprisingly, most of the violence does occur, and we have to face that fact that violence occurs in sex work. Most of it occurs on the street for street workers. Street workers are vulnerable.
Okay.
If you are talking about escorts, it is not prevalent. As a matter of fact, I would venture to say that it's rare. I interviewed a sex worker who had also was a madam, and so she had a great deal of knowledge about the sex workers who were working for her. And one time, one of the girls complained that a guy was a little rough. That's about it. And there's some other statistics I don't have on my fingertips, but they show that the higher echelon, violence is just not a big factor. One researcher, now let me see, once again, I don't have my fingertips, but she compared sex workers with orderlies in a hospital. And she found the orderlies were subject to violence more often than the sex worker. You know, and that does not trivialize the violence of a sex worker. Of course, that's a bad thing. We have to make sure that sex workers have police protection and the sex workers respect them when they call for work. But if you're talking to a person who believes, who says that, violence is endemic, it's not true. It's not true. And here again, there's empirical studies about violence. And it is there. No question about it, but you have to be careful, what you're talking about. And it is not endemic. It is not pervasive. I don't think you would use the word pervasive for violence and sex work. But what interests me even more than how much violence goes on, what interests me as a lawyer is what is the effect of our laws on violence?
Right.
Now we have studies that show when you prohibit sex work, you increase violence. If you decriminalize sex work, that itself helps to protect sex workers. And there's more than one research on this topic, more than one. One example, which was astonishing to me, once again, this conventional guy in Rhode Island, a state in the United States, they decriminalized indoor sex work. Now, this is a weird example because they did it by accident. They really didn't intend to, but the legislators are amending legislation, and the prohibition on sex work only applied to street work. So for 6 years, from 2003 to 2009, indoor sex work was decriminalized. Whoa! Now, they finally got their act together in 2009, and the prohibitionists came in, and no doubt they were screaming about it, and so they reinstated prohibition. So now Rhode Island is another typical state where it's all prohibited. But for 9 years, it was legal indoors. So, what a wonderful empirical experiment, right? Look, you get 9 years, it's legal indoors. What happened? One of the things that happened was the population at large, not just sex workers at large, the rates of gonorrhea went down 40%. Nobody can really explain these results, but they're there. And as far as rape, the instances of rape at large went down 30%. Went down 30% when it was legalized indoors. Now, that's just one example. It's very, very hard to tease out the cause and effect here. But that's just one example of research showing that it doesn't solve or mitigate the violence problem because you make sex work itself illegal. It just doesn't work that way.
So another type of claims that we hear very often from prohibitionists is that they say that all sex workers are in some way or another victimized by their clients. Sometimes they even make the claim that all sex work involves involves sexual assault. So, but taking into account the sex workers you interviewed, what did they have to say about the kinds of people that their clients were, and how did they describe their interactions with them?
This same woman who was a sex worker and then became a madam that I interviewed, and she put it very, very succinctly. as her experience as a madam.
Mm-hmm.
She said, I asked her about clients. How do sex workers feel about their clients? What kind of people are they? She said, look, 5% of your clients are guys that you hate. You never want to see them again, even if you're making money from them. They just, they don't like them. Don't like them at all. Another 5% of your clients are guys, and she's speaking from a woman's perspective, a woman providing to a man. Yes. 5% of your clients, you just love them. They really like the guy. I mean, sex workers are human beings, and they really like the guy. They really do. The rest are 90%. 90% are just not good or bad. It's just work. It's just a guy, another guy, and he's okay, but that's all. Now, from everything that I've read, that seems to be a very accurate picture that you can draw. Sex workers will say, yeah, sometimes they're shitty, but most of the time they're not. They ask one woman, if you didn't have to do sex work for money, what would you do? Marvelous question, right? Gee, she doesn't have to do it for money. What would she say? She would say, I would go out fewer times in a week, but she would still go out. I wouldn't go out all that time. Take it easy. But I would go out, like, I don't know what she said, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, because she enjoys the power. She just likes it. Okay, I mean, that's another one example. So, in my book, I could go through and I could point to everyone who said their clients were just fine. But as you say, that's not a representative sample in a rigorous statistical way. So you don't have a number that you can reveal and say, well, this percentage of clients are really bad people. But the idea that men who victimize you are characterized clients, that's just not true. That's just not true. It is not true. There's one woman who she did a TED talk. She was one of the plaintiffs in a famous lawsuit in Canada, which got the laws changed up there. And she had this wonderful way of putting it. She said, who are sex workers? Well, sex workers, we're just normal people, and you meet us every day at the grocery store. And there's clients. Clients are just normal people too, There's an accountant, there's a lawyer, there's this guy, there's that guy. And it's not true that they control everything that happens. But, in other words, it's ordinary. The relationship is much more ordinary than people want to think. So what do you conclude from all this? Clients are not victimizers. There are clients who are criminals. There are clients who are murderers, for God's sake. It does happen, but that doesn't characterize clients. As a matter of fact, another got to throw this in. Another sex worker, and more than one sex worker has told me this. A lot of clients want to talk. They want to use a sex worker's therapist. And one of them in particular was telling me about this. She's actually, she has a degree in physics, and she edits physics notebooks. Just, you got to tell that to your friend who says that all sex workers are coerced because they need the money. They don't have any options. And it's just crazy. But she was telling me, yeah, I get clients who come by more than once. She's not just talking about one client. Clients will come by and we'll sit down there and we'll talk and we'll chat. And he likes to talk. And she says, I realize I got to let him know, time is passing, and your hour or your 2 hours, it's almost up, just to let him know. And he says, no, I just want to talk. Let's just keep talking. And those kinds of images are images that conventional people never get. They never see that picture of a client, but it's out there. They need to see it.
Did the sex workers you interviewed, did any one of them mention or complained about being objectified?
No. I mean, that phrase is sort of a infinitely malleable tool, I suppose. Um, uh, well, the answer is no, and it would be odd if they did. Prohibitionists who want to use that term and say, well, sex workers are bad because once again, it's a man and a woman, and the woman is being objectified. And you just have to throw up your hands, and you simply have to ask what in hell they mean by that. If you mean that the only reason the man is paying her is to have sex with her, well, that may be true. It also may be true that the woman doesn't want him to be interested in anything else. There are, sex workers, and she may be in this book, or it may be in another article, talking about, well, one of the more difficult things in her work is managing the expectations of her clients who want to get to know her too much, or clients who will, and then there's another part of the job, which is emotional work. Someone will sell the girlfriend experience, which means at least you simulate an emotional attachment, just affection and kissing. Well, I can imagine very well that there's a woman who, doesn't want any of that. Let's just have sex and be done with it. She's the one who wants that. It's just as plausible to believe that the woman in this transaction really wants to limit it just to sexual act as it is to think of the man as doing that. There's a lot of literature on men who don't want just the sex. They want some an affective relationship, playful, kissing, simulating a girlfriend, or just talking for her. And once again, there are all kinds. And if by objectify you mean just sex, well, okay, that's a context in where just sex is okay. If you mean they're always like that, or they're always sort of not considerate of the woman, is that what you mean? Well, yeah, I'm sure there are rude clients out there, no question about it. Does that characterize sex work? No. There are guys who are timid. There are guys who don't know what to do. There are guys who want kinky stuff. There are guys who just want to talk. There are guys who are rude just because they're kind of stupid and don't know any better. There are all kinds. They're people, they're human beings. But nothing about sex work. Nothing that's intrinsic about sex work.
Right. So another type of claim that prohibitionists make has to do with power dominance, where they say or claim that sex work is the product of male domination and patriarchy. They use words like that. So, I mean, is there any way of empirically testing such a claim?
Not precisely, simply because the claim itself is not precise. And the best you can do is just to try to speculate on why people would say things like that, since as I've mentioned empirically and talking to sex workers, there's no basis to say that whatsoever. And perhaps the is so I speculate and say, well, there's the old-fashioned notion of women's place is in the home. A man's place is to go out and make a living. Mm-hmm. That then spawns the idea of women are economically dependent on men. Women are vulnerable to men, and which is obviously very true in many respects.
Yes.
And so then your next thought, you just think about all women as being vulnerable to men, and the way a woman survives is to attach herself to a man. And then if you have that in your head, and then you say, well, prostitution then is a way for a woman to survive, but she's not getting marriage out of it, which in this very old-fashioned way of thinking is the prize, the goal that she needs to get in order to economically survive. And so if you think that way, then you think of the man as dangling economic viability in front of a woman, and she's out to try to get it. Now you have a picture of a power relationship that's very unhealthy, and the man dominates the woman economically. And that's the best I could do to try to figure out why women would say, well, sex work is spawned by the patriarchy. It makes as much sense to say that sex work is spawned by women who don't want to be attached to a man, women who want other options, and men who discover their own power and decide they're going to use it. That's an equally plausible explanation of the genesis of sex work. And then, there's no substitute for, forgetting all the theories and to just sitting down and talking to sex workers concretely and finding out what benefits them in their lives and what doesn't. And if you want to talk about where it all comes from, that is a very, very difficult thing to do. Sex work has been in human cultures for a very, very long time. Mm-hmm. Women getting consideration for sex is a normal and prevalent thing, whether you think it's a good thing or not. And only, explicit monetary payment is called prostitution and triggers this kind of stigma. So, if you want to go into, where does it all come from? That would be an enormously complicated enterprise. And I suggest that it would be irrelevant for what kind of laws you pass today about what sex workers are telling you today about what helps them or doesn't help them.
So we've been talking about some of the main claims made by prohibitionists and also what sex workers and also their clients have to say in their own words about their own experiences. But there's also, as I mentioned earlier, there are also some feminists out there that are, I will call them here, sex positive. That is, they support the normalization of sex work and they are for pornography and all of that. What do you think about the role that they could play in these sort of debates if they are not sex workers themselves?
Well, I was going to say they play a great work until you added the caveat, not sex workers themselves. A lot of the very powerful voices out there are women who have been sex workers, but I'm sure not all of them. And I'm sure they would all consider themselves to be feminists and have every right to consider themselves to be feminists. And their voices are very, very impressive. I simply didn't write a book about them. I wrote a book about sex negative people.
Right.
And I simply wasn't talking about them. They are out there and they are very, very impressive. I mean, Caitlin Bailey has started the Old Pros. I've listened to her a few times. She sounds most articulate person you can imagine. Norma Jean Almodovar, that I quote in my book, she has written her own book. She started her own organization, Ella, Aella, I believe. And that's the only name I know her by. She has been a sex worker, and she calls herself a data scientist now. And every time I listen to her, I say that's an accurate description. She's a data fiend, and she does all kinds of statistical work about sex workers. And so they're out there. They have strong voices, and there are they are leading the charge in a great deal of work to get legislators to either modify their prohibitions or to decriminalize sex work. This has gone on in Rhode Island, New York, Vermont. And you go on YouTube and you can look up, sex work legislation, and you will see sex work positivists lined up speaking to these legislative bodies. And so they're very encouraging.
So since earlier we talked a little bit about sex trafficking or the issue of traffic in the sex industry, taking into account that serious risk, what do you think should be done then to prevent it as much as possible?
Well, you should decriminalize consensual sex work and make allies of sex workers. And then a big problem will be get honest statistics so that you know what you're up against, and then you can fight it. And you need to fight it, but you'll have allies and sex workers. You will know if you have good numbers, you will know where it's happening, and you may get a handle on why it's happening. Mm-hmm. One problem with numbers, for example, is every time we have a Super Bowl in the United States, there are people who run around saying, oh no, now you're going to have a lot of prostitution and a lot of trafficking. So then what will happen is you will form a anti-trafficking law enforcement task force, mm-hmm. and it's all about trafficking. And you'll go out and you make a big production of this when all the crowds are here for the Super Bowl. And then you'll read in the paper about arrests that were made by the anti-trafficking people. You say, oh, we made 40 arrests. And that's it. Well, so the ordinary person reading the paper says the anti-trafficking force made 40 arrests. Oh, we've been saved from traffickers. How good. Well, they don't tell you that the people they arrested were traffickers. They just say the anti-trafficking force made the arrest. Well, the only thing the anti-trafficking force is doing is going out there harassing prostitutes. Because, well, somewhere there must be trafficking. So they go out and they arrest a whole bunch of consenting prostitutes. And their arrests, they really were arrested. And there really were 40 of them. And, maybe they found one person who was 17 years old instead of 18 years old. that's underage, so that counts as a trafficking victim, and that's what happened. So now what I'm saying is you have to get honest numbers about what the problem really is. If you get a handle what the problem really is, and you decriminalize prostitute, now we can rationally fight trafficking. And one other thing I should add, there are a lot of people who believe that a person who is a migrant to your country and a sex worker must be trafficked. In the United States, immigration is a big, big hot issue, and illegal immigration is a big, big hot issue. And so when you find a person who's a migrant, especially from a poor country, and they're doing sex work, then immediately people think of trafficking. After all, think of the word trafficking. It must mean movement. Actually, legally, it doesn't mean movement. It has nothing to do with movement. But that's the word that's in people's minds. Trafficking. You trafficked a migrant, and so now they're doing prostitution. So you arrest the migrant for prostitution. Now you think you've done something about trafficking. Nonsense. She is like any other sex worker. She's trying to find the best economic option that she can. One economic action was to sneak into the United States. The second economic option was to sell sex. That's what's happening. That's not trafficking. So you have all this corruption of trafficking statistics, so you really don't know what to fight or where to fight. Fix that, decriminalize, work with sex workers, and you fight trafficking.
So just for this last part of our conversation, I have a couple of questions for you specifically about the clients, because we've been focusing mostly on, for example, how sex workers are stigmatized. But in the case of the clients, in what ways are they stigmatized, and what are some of the most common ideas that people have about the clients of sex workers?
Well, they're stigmatized. I think the advantage that a client has is, in the long run, he may be able to hide the fact that he's a client a lot better than the woman can hide the fact that she's a sex worker. But there's no question that women are subjected to a much greater stereotype of a spoiled identity. The old-fashioned view of sexual purity and the old-fashioned view of sexual commodity and being destroyed. And now your identity is destroyed, and you can never go back and recover. All that kind of crap is out there that a woman has to face. But men are stigmatized. I mean, in the old-fashioned way, they're stigmatized because they're seen as doing something icky. You're having sex with a prostitute who's very undesirable. You may get a disease from her, and you're a loser. Only a loser would have to pay for sex. Nowadays, it's evolving, and the evolving stereotype is you must be harming someone. You must be harming someone because you paid for sex, and that does not compare to the stereotype of a woman who's somehow been branded for life in a spoiled identity. It doesn't compare with that. But nevertheless, it's a real stereotype that that men suffer if they pay for sex, and they don't want to say it. And it doesn't increase it's not supposed to increase your self-esteem. But I was happy to find the clients talking, and you'll notice this is apropos to stigma. Mm-hmm. It's actually easier to find sex workers to interview than it is to find clients to interview. So I was fortunate in finding client statements that I was able to put in the book, and what comes through is their ordinariness. That's a theme that I think of as ordinary. for conventionally minded people, there is a big chasm between real life and sex work. And sex work has got to be something really, really strange. It's either a really, really bad thing, or it's a really, really empowering thing, or, the woman is really, really undesirable, or she's really, really desirable, but it's different. And that's what's not true. Sex workers and clients are ordinary people.
Mm-hmm.
And the sex that they engage in is enjoyable for ordinary reasons. And it is surprising how little money changes that. And that's very, very difficult for conventional people to believe. I digressed a little bit there. With the clients, they suffer stereotypes. It's not like a woman's stereotype. And what they have to say is, gee, I'm happy that, that I found this woman. And you can find men talk about bad experiences. But it's interesting, up in Washington, D.C., they had a big anti-trafficking bust, and they busted people who talked about the sex workers that they hired on this website, and they got busted for promoting prostitution. Well, if you look at the website, if you look at the things they said, most of them are very positive. These men are hanging around saying very positive things about sex work. Well, I really like her. I hope she doesn't move, and oh, wow, this one is really nice. And oh, my God. And of course you have bad clients, like I've said, and sometimes there are bad experiences. Yeah, that happens. But, the atmosphere created by this website was a very positive one about sex workers. My God.
Do you think that, of course, with your experience, not only interviewing some sex workers and also some clients and dealing with or reading or learning about some of the arguments put forth by prohibitionists, do you get the sense that most of these ideas that they have or develop about sex work itself, the sex workers, and then also the clients stem mostly from them having specific moral values, that they are, for example, more socially conservative, and so they associate sex work with something that goes against, for example, family values, monogamy, and stuff like that? I mean, do you get that sense from what you studied there or not?
My sense is that, let's just say morals, the sense of morals, that is so deeply intertwined in everything that is said, except for the most bare bones empirical analysts, that you really can't parse out moral underpinnings and what may be just other philosophical underpinnings or abstract underpinnings, even though the 21st century is different than the 20th century and certainly different than the 19th century. All of us have been raised in a culture that has something to say, something moral to say about sex, and something moral to say about women, and something moral to say about sex work.
Mm-hmm.
We've grown up in that culture. We didn't just go to school and learn it. It was inculcated in us as children. To me, it's obvious that never goes away when I listen to prohibitionists talk about the maladies of sex work. It's just floating around back there all the time. And it's what, it's what means, I think, to a large extent, it is the reason why people can get away with using the words like exploitation and power differential without defining it, without getting careful to what they're saying. They can get away with that because they're talking to people with this moral substratum in the back of their minds. It's sort of there. It's an audience that's waiting to hear that. And they can get away with it, which is all the more reason why we have to emphasize concrete things that sex workers say. And it just seems to me that that's a more effective way to talk in this conventional world that we live in, rather than trying to sort of out-philosophize or out-moralize the moralists. You end up going in circles, and people can have the moral beliefs that they believe. My point is, well, listen to what sex workers say, and maybe you'll leave them alone, and you can just, you can have the morals that you want to have, but before you start imposing them on sex workers, listen to the concrete things that they have to say.
So I have one final question then. Earlier, you talked about decriminalization as a solution to sex trafficking, for example. But another approach that some people have to prostitution is the end demand approach. So could you tell us about that approach, and do you think that it would solve any of the issues identified by sex-negative people, sex-negative feminists, and so on, and that it would even be good for the sex workers themselves?
Well, we've got research on that.
Okay.
By and large, the answer is no. Sweden is the one who started this, saying, well, we'll outlaw buying sex, but we won't outlaw selling it. And that is sold as an abstract issue, the same way anything else is sold, is because it hurts women, so let's punish the men. But then you add on to that the assumption that women themselves are sort of these children. You infantilize children, say, well, they really don't have anything to do with it. This is all doing of men, so we'll just outlaw men. The more empirical effort was to say, we will do the end demand in order to eradicate trafficking. As a way to, as an empirical matter, if you outlaw buying sex, the market will dry up for sex slaves. You won't have sex slaves anymore. The statistical analysis is complex, but the results are pretty much out now that in Sweden, there's no evidence that decreased trafficking. Didn't happen. I have not seen evidence from any other country that later on took up that manner. Other Scandinavian countries, France is a late entry, Israel is a late entry, both the Irelands did it. I have not seen evidence in any of those locations that say, if you do in demand, trafficking decreases. Now, so that's empirical evidence for it. Now let's just think about it. Just think about it logically. I mean, as it stands now, trafficking is illegal, even in a jurisdiction that decriminalizes the whole thing. Even like New Zealand or New South Wales, trafficking is a crime. It's a serious crime. Okay. So now you have people who say, well, okay, if you have a jurisdiction, any jurisdiction, or let's say a jurisdiction where it's decriminalized, But we need to add on to that the criminalization of customers. So what is the customer supposed to think? I mean, the customer is not most jurisdictions in the United States. Sex work is a misdemeanor. In New Zealand, it's not a crime at all. And but sex work happens both in the United States, New Zealand. Customers are not deterred by it being a misdemeanor. The in demand suggests, as far as I can see, that you keep those same prohibition laws, but you only apply them to the buyer. If you keep those same prohibition laws in place, that means it's a misdemeanor for the guy to buy sex. It is a felony to engage in trafficking. If that felony, the fact that you will go to prison, if that is not a deterrent, why do you believe that it being a misdemeanor, if you buy sex from anyone, is going to deter you? And I know I went on round and round about that a bit. Say I'm a male and I'm thinking about I'm going to buy a slave. I'm going to engage in sex trafficking, and then I realize if I get caught, that is a felony. I will go to prison. And then I think, well, now if I do that, that will also be a misdemeanor. So gee whiz, I won't do it. Does that make any sense? If the fact that it is a felony does not deter me, why would a misdemeanor prostitution violation deter me? But that is what the in-demand theory is. It is make all prostitution illegal, this misdemeanor, but just for the buyer. It doesn't make sense that would deter criminals from abducting and forcing people. That's not a deterrent. They hide from you, and they're willing to risk prison. And even if that was a little too convoluted, the point is, research has been done. It doesn't work. It has some effects. I think in Sweden, for some time, sex workers moved from the street indoors. Maybe that made people happy, although now they may have moved back out. Mm-hmm. Sex workers will tell you, what happens. What happens when you criminalize my clients? You pretend to have compassion for me. This is the root of it all. You want to help me, you have compassion for me, so you outlaw my clients. You know what happens? What happens is my respectable law-abiding clients that I love, they don't come to see me anymore. I'm left with the criminals, the people who don't care about the law, the people who don't care about respectability. It just makes my client base worse. That's one of the things that sex workers actually say about it. But it's a funny theory because in the end, it infantilizes women. It doesn't recognize the fact that sex work is something that women choose because it's their best option. You're not helping her by putting a cop at her door and saying, we're not going to let the clients in. And by the way, we're doing this because we love you, sex worker. We have compassion for you. So we're not going to give you a better job. We're just going to put a cop at your doorstep and not let your clients come in. That makes no sense. That makes no legal sense. That makes no moral sense.
Great. So let's end on that note then. And the book is again Sex Workers and Their Clients in Their Own Words. Of course, I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Mosley, just before we go, are there any places on the internet where people can find your work, or are there any online resources you would like to point to?
Well, you can just put in the title and you can find it. The publisher is Palgrave Macmillan, and you can go into their website and find it. When you find the book, you can actually purchase individual chapters if you like. That's something the publisher has done. But you can just, it's easy enough to find. You just type in the title.
Great. So, Dr. Mosley, thank you so much again for coming on the show. It's been a very informative and fascinating conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for the interview.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbourd, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanous, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.